Good morning and welcome to our second webinar for our collection management course and manual implementation. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you'll find this very useful and helpful in your day-to-day job. We are going to start, but I'll start with introducing the people who will be presenting to you today. We have Chanel Ribeiro, who is the project manager for the NSCF, and Michelle Hamer, who is the NSCF lead. Today's webinar will be on documentation of collection activities. So let's get started. Before we get started, we just need to go through some guidelines of engagement. So some rules that we need to know for us to engage with each other. Please keep your contributions helpful and considerate of the host and also other participants. Please use the chat box to say hello. I see people haven't started yet, so please go ahead now and say hello and let us know which institution you are joining us from. So for example, I'm Fulu and I am from the NSCF Hub, simple as that. So let's say good morning, greet each other, and that way we can interact with each other better now that after saying hello, after the greetings. Thank you for doing that. I see they are coming in. Good morning to everyone. I see Pamandla from SIAB. I see Adriana from ARC. Let's keep them coming. You can use the Q&A box to add your questions. This you can do during the webinar. We won't be able to answer the questions when we are presenting, but we'll do that after we finish with the webinar. So you can keep your questions there in the Q&A so we don't miss them. We don't advise you to use the chat box for questions because we might lose them. So use the Q&A box. Due to some time constraints that we might experience, some of your questions might not be answered live on the webinar, but we will make sure that afterwards we answer them. The video is going to be uploaded on YouTube and on Facebook, so you can choose where to ask your questions. You can also use the WhatsApp group for those that are on the WhatsApp group. For any information about the course, you can go to the link provided on our website, nscf.org.za, under resources and under collection management. You'll find all the information that you need from there. Thank you so much. I'll take you over to Michelle, who is going to get us started with the overview of the webinar.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar and this session, which is part of the manual implementation process, as well as part of the curation and collection management training course. So this is chapter 3 in the manual, and I think it's something that is not especially exciting to those of us who like being out in the field and rather being doing things rather than writing things or typing things. And so it's maybe not the most exciting part of the manual, but it's a really critical part. And we've put it right at the start because the collection documentation spans all the different work and activities related to the collection. So it's important to do it in the beginning because it covers everything. So what collection documentation are we talking about when we talk about this? We're talking about an accession or acquisition register. That's a record of everything that comes into the collection or into the institution, all the specimens. We're talking about a catalog book or an inventory of everything that's in that collection with details of each specimen or specimen lot. We're talking about information about the collection, so something about what it is, where it's from, and how it's stored. We're talking about all the different policies, standards, and procedures for many different aspects of the work. So the rules that guide how collections are cared for, used, and managed. The fifth one is the monitoring and assessment records, and this can be for a wide range of different things: pests, climate, risks, disaster records, what happened, what did you do, any restoration, health and safety records, so incident reports, training, monitoring reports, access records, so visitors, loans, tissue supplied, data, images supplied. Any other documents relating to the collections or the specimens, so that can be field notes from collectors, whether they're historical or current, data sheets, images, so photographs, artwork, notes made by researchers, and then finally documents about documents. And so this would be policies, procedures, and standards about the documents themselves. So you can see that there's a wide range of different documents involved with collections. Okay, next slide. So when we did the NRF assessment of collections in 2009, 2010, policies, procedures, and standards was one of the things we looked at, and very few institutions had these. Some institutions had a manual, but it was outdated. Some had some documents, but they generally didn't use them or didn't know where they were. And it was really not an aspect of collection management that was high up in the list of priority to do things. Many institutions did not have an up-to-date accessions register that recorded each object as it came into the institution. So a lot of material would come in, go straight into a freezer and be left there for a year or two undocumented. Loans that came in went straight to the researcher, not documented. And large numbers of undocumented specimens. So this was the situation then. I think since then, there have been improvements in some institutions, but I think that there's still a lot of gaps. So there's still a long way to go from where we are now to being very professional in terms of documentation. Okay, next slide. Okay, so after we'd done that assessment, and then also over the past few months, thinking about the manual implementation, we just thought about why is documentation so neglected in collections management? And I did get a lot of responses when I was doing that assessment. It's now more than 10 years ago. And these are some of the sort of responses that came out and some of my interpretation. And so we're going to do a poll. Let's do an honest assessment of your feelings about documentation and paperwork. And paperwork can be digital, it can be electronic, or it can be hard copy. So we've got 10 feelings here, or attitudes towards collection documentation, and we're going to do a poll. We're asking you to say whether you think it's true, untrue, or not true, and it's about the way you feel. So the first one is just a lot of bureaucratic stuff. It takes up too much of the time that I just don't have. I'm too busy. I don't think it's necessary. We've managed without paperwork until now. It would help me. I would like to meet global standards. It should be done by someone else. I'm a collection manager, not a paper pusher. I would do it if I knew how, but it just seems overwhelming. And then one that maybe, I'm scared that if I write down what I should be doing, then the auditors or my manager could use it to get to me. If it's not written down, then no one can hold me to it. And of course, it might just cost too much money. We don't have budget. So can we launch the poll, and let's give everybody a chance to go through those and vote how they feel about those 10 points. Right, there's the poll. So off you go. We'll give you a few minutes. Don't overthink it, just answer. Diesel is asking if there's only one question. So I think that I'd actually meant for each of those 10 to vote on each of them, whether it's true or not true or untrue. So sorry, that's miscommunication from our side.
Maybe people could just vote if they think the collection documentation is necessary, and it will help them with their work. True. And if they don't think it's necessary, not true.
Okay. Okay, so if you think that you need, if you think it's important, then vote true. If you think it's unnecessary, vote untrue. And if you're unsure, just vote unsure. Okay, so it's mixed. And I would think that it's mixed. So some people think that it is important, but I think that a lot of people will think that they don't have time, that it's just a lot of bureaucracy. And some people might just kind of be unsure about what it's all about and whether it's necessary or whether it's worth investing in. Yeah, so I think sorry, so the poll, we should have actually just made sure that we knew amongst ourselves. But I suspect that a lot of these negative feelings are very common. I think that a lot of people will think that it's a lot of bureaucracy, that it takes up far too much time, that it's not necessary. And it just is not worth the investment in it. So Fuller says maybe we should do it at the end. Maybe people will have changed their mind by the end. Okay, let's not worry too much about that. Can we move on to the next slide? So I think that there will be mixed feelings. And I'll hand over to Chanel at this stage.
Thank you, Michelle, and morning everyone again. So I think let's start and look at why collection documentation is important. So firstly, it's important for current and future staff to be able to make decisions about collection activities, what should be done, how and when. But it's also important for the credibility of the collections for research. So maintenance of full records detailing the source of collection objects and preservation and conservation interventions is critical for performing different types of analysis for research purposes and for ensuring the integrity of the collections for future generations. Also, the collections are state funded and we should be accountable and responsible in the way that we care for collections. Then there's also the matter of legal compliance. So the documents are required by law, and this includes the hard copy, accession registers, and inventory, permits, donation forms, loan forms, health and safety and risk assessments are all required by either NEMBA and TOPS, CITES, BABS regulations, Animal Disease Control Act, and also Occupational Health and Safety Act, and GRAP 103. So as you will see on the slide, it says hard copy accession registers. And there was a lot of debate about this at the CMC working group when they were developing the manual. So not all documents need to be in hard copy. For some documents, electronic versions are sufficient. And for the discussions here, when we mention documentation, it can either be hard copy or electronic copy unless specified. But in some cases, such as for accessions, CITES requires a permanent record kept, which means that hard copy documentation of accession objects should be maintained in order to register as a scientific institution. So the accession register should be a permanent, and so that it cannot be altered or removed. And all items accepted temporarily or permanently by a collection institution must be properly, fully, and permanently documented to ensure that their origins, identity requirements, and location are traceable. And entry records must be maintained for collection objects resulting from staff field trips or donated by an external person or institution, or collection objects on loan, or those deposited temporarily for expert identification. And then if incoming collections are not accessioned into the collection for some reason, say if it's in poor condition, this must also be recorded in the accession register together with the fate of the collection objects and date. This is also applicable to individual collection objects received as part of a lot. So if they are discarded or returned to the donor or donated to another institution. And note that the accession register is different to the catalogue book or inventory, which includes only those specimens permanently incorporated into the collection. So I'm just going to give over to Michelle for a moment, and she's going to run through an example of an accession and just explain the details.
Okay, thanks, Chanel. So yes, I put this together just to show what we're talking about with the accessions register, because I think there was a lot of discussion in the working group and quite a lot of confusion and debate and difficulty in sort of separating what a catalog book and what an accession register is and what's recorded in the accession register. So this is just an example. So somebody, a student, a master student, finishes their project and they want to donate their collection to the institution. And so this drawer of flies comes in. And as soon as it comes into the institution, it's captured in the accession register, and that should be handwritten. And it should be assigned a code, and I just used, okay, you know, you might have your own coding or numbering system in your institution, but yeah, I used the date, and you can say it's the 6th accession for the day. And we've got a description of what it is. It's a drawer, and it's got 86 pinned specimens of bombardier flies collected at Cathedral Peak in the Drakensberg for a master's project that being done through the University of Pretoria. The specimens are all labeled and identified. There's the collector date, and it's just a year because they're all maybe different dates. Who brought it in? It wasn't a student, it was a supervisor. Who received it and recorded it? Say where you put it. So it was put into the new accessions cupboard, which we've labeled as A number 6. And then there were some documents that came with it, and you write down a list of those documents. It was a collecting permit, there was a data sheet with abundance and flower records, and there was a completed donation form. So there's number of different documents, and that can be it in your accession register. Then what you might want to do, and some institutions do it but not all of them, but it's advisable, you send it through for capture into your database into your accessions table. It's not yet put into the permanent inventory. It's in your accessions, and you capture the details for each of those specimens. So the locality, the date they were collected, the method that was used for collection, all of that. And later, once it's incorporated into the collection, ideally each of those specimens will get a unique catalog number, but you can add that later. For now, you're using the accession number for each of them. And then those documents that came in as well, they should be filed in a hard copy file, but they should also be scanned and uploaded into your database and linked to each specimen, so that later you know that specimen was collected on that permit, it was donated according to that form. There's more information about it in data sheets. So you're linking everything. And then your hard copy forms that came in, you file them, and you make sure that they're numbered so that they also link back to that accession record. And you can number each of them ABC or 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. So you can see every accession that comes into your collection, there's a lot of paperwork. And if you don't have all of this and you don't have systems and processes, the credibility of that tray of specimens will always be brought into question. Later on, when things disappear, somebody wants more information, or you need to check whether it was legally collected, you've got to scratch around and spend a lot of time trying to find everything. And so at the end of the day, you actually save time by having these, having a very organized system for capturing data. Okay, thanks, Chanel. Back to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, so we're going to go to another poll, and the question is, do you have an accession register in your institution? I'll launch it now. Sure, this one's going to work right. So there you go, you can just start voting. Okay, it looks like most people have voted. So most people say that they do have an accession register and it's used all the time for accessions. Then others say, yes, but it's not used anymore. And a few people have said they've never had one or they don't know. So yes, I think this is a good opportunity to look into that, seeing as it is required by law and by CITES. So moving on to the collection inventory, ideally a hard copy of the inventory should be maintained, but many institutions have moved away from this and to an electronic database. And it depends on the feasibility, you know, how many accessions do you do per year? So if you don't do as many, then it is feasible to have a catalog book or a hard copy. But CITES does say that registering an institution for CITES permit exemption for the exchange of materials requires that a permanent catalogue book be maintained. They do say this may be in form of a handwritten catalogue book or a print out of the database. And then anything that is done to a specimen or a lot must be recorded here. So for example, if it's treated in any way, or moved to a different location. And then I'm going to hand over to Fulu now.
Thank you, Chanel. Now we're going to go through information about the collection. So there is a document that is required, which is the collection overview. So it has to name the collection, what's the name of that collection that you are responsible for or that you're working on. that is in your institution, what it is, including a brief description about the collection. A description would be that this is a bird collection, these kinds of birds are in the collection, how many, and all that. The history of it, meaning how did it come into being? How did you end up having it in your collections? The significance of it, so the importance of that collection. Why is it important? Not only for you as an institution, but also for society. How does it benefit society? This should be included in that overview. Also, how many specimens are in that collection? If you don't have, if the collection is too much for you to have an exact number, then you can have an estimate, a close estimate of how many specimens you have. It also has to include how it's organized. So if someone has to go into that collection, they have to know the order that you use, whether you use you use the date of its collection to organize it, or whatever method that you use. It needs to have that in the overview. Where is it housed? Is it in your own institution? The name of your institution. Where is your institution? Is it in Limpopo province, for example? Which region? It has to be specific to where someone can find it. How is it stored? So the environmental conditions of it, the environmental indications, so the temperature that it's under, the humidity that it's under, the amount of light that it's exposed to, the climate control equipment that you have in the collection to keep it safe, fire detection systems that you have in the collection, and suppression systems. And any structural faults that are there. Is there any structural conditions that it's not supposed to be under, but it's under currently? This document has to show the real state of that collection, not what's required, or not what you wish it to be, but what it is currently, its current state, its true state. Even the storage system, so the shelves, the cabinets, the containers, the preservatives that you are using to preserve the collection. Also, a summary of general condition, the general condition of the collection. So, is it in a good condition according to international standards? Or is it in a condition that is not good, that still needs work? You need to indicate that, and you need to do that truthfully. This helps for someone who is coming into the collection to have a good idea of what state the collection is under. This collection overview document has to include the date that it was compiled, who compiled the overview, a sign off by the person who compiled it, as well as the responsible authority. So whoever compiled it, their manager or whoever they report to, has to also sign off on that document. Next slide. Going on to policies, procedures, standards, and forms, all of these should be kept in one centralized place. This can be an electronic folder, it can be a hard copy file, but the important thing is that every staff member has to have access to these copies. You can decide whether you want to go electronic or you want to go hard copy, whatever works for you. But it's important for staff members to have access. Policies at least should be publicly available on your website, so that anyone can have access to them, even your staff, even people from outside. Remember, a policy is not supposed to have too much detailed information. It's just a high-level information about your collection. There should be versioning and a date system and a sign-off process. So you as an institution need to know that this is how we version our documents. This is how, so you might decide that you start with the name of the document, then the date, and then maybe you want to include the person who's responsible for that document, whatever system you decide on. But you also need to decide on the sign-off process. So when you start, whoever starts a document, who signs it off from that person who goes on to do the final sign-off. So you need to decide on that. Next slide. Collection level monitoring. So these are records of your pest control and monitoring, records of climate monitoring, which is your temperature and humidity levels, pest outbreaks and details about that, any large-scale conservation actions carried out. So you need to keep information about whatever actions have been taken in that collection, whether it was checking preservative levels or relabeling, whatever it is, there has to be a record of that. This has to include the date that this was done, who was involved in doing that. It has to show that. Also, any historical records about the collection. This needs to be filed. So all this information is required. Next slide. Then in terms of disaster documentation, you need to have a disaster report or disaster reports. So if you were unfortunate to go through a disaster, whether it's a fire, a flooding, whatever that is deemed a disaster and that affects the collections, there has to be a report on that, and it has to be kept on file. Even a damage assessment forms to indicate what was damaged, at what level, and all that information. Also restoration efforts. So how do you plan to restore whatever was damaged? This information needs to be recorded. I'm going to take it back to Michelle to speak about health and safety.
Okay, so the other set of documents will be about health and safety, and all institutions will have their own health and safety documentation, but some of that is directly relevant to the collections, and that should be kept with the collections. So if you've done health and safety inspections in the collection areas, those should be kept on file. Incident reports, so if somebody dropped a bottle of specimens and cut themselves, those are incident reports that must be kept on file. Any health and safety training given to the staff who work in the collections, that needs to be kept. And then tests that staff must undergo. So according to the Act, so all of this is actually required by law. It's the Health and Safety Act. It falls under the Department of Labor, and they can come at any time and ask to see these documents. So the Act does prescribe You know, it does say that staff who are exposed to chemicals need to go for regular testing. And so a record should be kept, what tests need to be done, how often, and which staff must go, and then to record when they did actually go. So here you don't have to record what the outcome of those tests were. That can often be confidential or have sensitive information in, but you just need to make sure that you can say these people went for that test according to a schedule that we've got documented. And then air monitoring tests. So again, if you work in a collection where there's likely to be fumes or any kind of pollutant or toxin in the air, the Act also says that you need to monitor those levels, and it should be documented which tests must be done, how often, and there you can record the results of those tests. So all of that should be filed. And then any maintenance that's required for health and safety, do you need to do checks on your ladders or any other equipment where there's a risk to staff? And any report should be kept for those. It might be your fire extinguisher reports. And then any records of fire drills, emergency preparation exercises. So I'm sure that you do them regularly, but do you keep a record? This was what was done. This is what the finding was from that exercise. Did all the staff respond? Were there any problems identified? And then also any tests done for toxicity of specimens. So we know that a lot of the old specimens were treated with really bad poisons, arsenic, for example. Have you tested any of them to see if there's any residual poison on them? Keep those records. So this is a really serious one to make sure that you do have, because this can go to court. So if anybody is injured on duty or anybody gets sick from being exposed to anything, then you can be questioned about whether you've kept these records, whether you've done what the Act says you have to do. If you have, then you're fine. If you haven't, then your manager will probably be in trouble, but someone will be in trouble. All right, next slide. And then I think this is probably one area where most institutions do quite well. So access request form. So every time that you get a request for a loan, you file that. And then a loan book or a database. But remember that it needs to be a permanent record. So what CITES requires and TOPS is that there's a record every time you send out a loan. You've got it documented and when it came back. And any agreements with that loan need to all be kept on file. DNA tissues, DNA extracts or tissue samples that you supplied, also that needs to be documented and filed. And any documents associated with that. So export permits, material transfer agreements. Then a visitor book or visitor register. I know that most institutions do have them. Every time somebody comes there, they have to sign it. And that needs to be kept, retained. And then data and images provided. Do you have a register? Every time you've given out data, you keep a record of it. If you supply images, then you keep a record of that. And any agreements that have gone with the data or images provided. Right, next slide. And then general documents associated with the collection. So we know that there's really important field notes from historical collectors. They described what the weather was like. They described exactly what they did when they collected things, where they collected, what it looked like. And those are irreplaceable records that add a huge amount of value to the collections. And I think traditionally they've been put somewhere and just left there. And I'm not sure whether they registered, catalogued, but we need, you know, if they're not duplicated, we need to try and get that sorted out. And then also important are data sheets, photos and artwork done that may be associated with specific specimens. and you might have publications that came from the use of specimens. So all of this is part of the scientific value of these collections, and it needs to be managed in an archival kind of system. Okay, next slide. I think Chanel can take over here.
Yes, so that's a lot of documents that we've talked about. And to ensure that we manage those documents, we need a document about the documents. So this is called the document management policy. And it's a high-level document that includes high-level policy statements, and it defines what information your organization must keep as a record, how to manage those records, and how to ensure that the records and the documents are secure and backed up, amongst others. In other words, it helps to establish a uniform rule across collections and the institution for the management of documents. A few examples of such policy statements are there must be a date and versioning system for all documents. All documents relating to the collections will be retained by the institutions. The approved process to be followed for disposal or discarding of any documents relating to the collections. So these are high-level policy statements that will guide you, but then in addition to that, the policy will refer to more detailed standards and procedures or workflows. So standards for documents are things like storage, where collections should be stored, what the access control conditions should be, and then environmental conditions. Should the documents be hard copy or electronic? Where will it be filed? What type of pen will you use in your accession register? And then, as we've been mentioning, Fulu mentioned it as well, is the labeling and versioning of documents. So we thought that we could give a small tutorial on developing a labeling and versioning standards if people are interested. But I've just taken a screen grab of the NSCF labeling system or standards at the bottom of the page there. So it does give an example of how to label each document, the file name and version, the release status. Is it a draft? Is it a final? You'll have the author name, the date that it was created, the source, for example, data working group, or it came from the research working group or the advisory committee. And then if there's a change to the document, the reason for change or version updates, and if you need to include a confidentiality statement. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll just see it also explains the version sequence. So I'm not going to go into too much detail there. That's just an example for you. And then there's also the procedures for collection documentation development, or the policy development. It's a workflow. There's a small image there of a workflow and what it should include. So it should include, is it a draft? Will it go for consultation? The revisions it goes through, who does it go to for revisions? Who does it go to when it's finalized to be approved, and so forth, and when it should be reviewed. And then also it should include backups and where the backups will be stored, or the duplication of the documents. So how will it be backed up? Will you scan the complete register, or will you just upload it to a folder? And so forth. Just to continue with backups. Sorry, my slides are a bit messed up here. Okay, now I see we'll go to backups later. And then also importantly is a register of all the documents. So with your document management policy and your standards and your procedures, it's important to have an inventory of all the documents that you have developed. And that should include the dates that it was developed, the date of signer, or who is the responsible person for the document. I also have a screenshot there again of an inventory that the NSCF uses. So the dates that it was released, the name of the document, what is the version? Is it a draft? Is it a final version? The status, has it been approved? By whom was it approved? The author, who is then usually also the responsible for the document. And then just to keep track, also a column on previous versions and names of the document. And then to return to backups. So all critical documents need to be backed up, duplicated, and one set kept in a secure place. Originals of old accession registers and catalog books should be stored in a fireproof safe. And then all field notes, data sheets, and images should be stored in a library and an environmentally controlled place. And then, of course, the databases need to be backed up off-site on a regular basis, following a documented procedure. So you'll have a workflow for backups as well. Okay, so I'm handing over to Fulu again, who will just talk about the upcoming discussion forum on the same topic on collection documentation.
Thanks, Chanel. So we will have the discussion forum connected to this webinar on 30 June, which is next week, Wednesday. That is going to cover, we're going to give a guidance on a collection documentation policy. We will also do some group work on developing a collection documentation policy. And we will then follow by having an open discussion. This will be on the main challenges with collection documentation that you will pick up from your group work, and what are the steps needed to make sure that the policy will be implemented in your institutions. Just to note, something that's very important, group work and open discussion part of the discussion forum will not be recorded. This is from the advice or suggestions that we took from some concerns. So we will not be recording any group work or open discussions. Also, the same applies for webinars. Any discussions that happen after the webinar, starting from today's webinar, will not be recorded. So when we are finished with these presentations, which we are now done, we are going to stop recording. So we advise that, especially for course participants, that if you are not able to attend discussion forums, you need to find a way of getting updated. Maybe you can have a colleague or someone else attend on your behalf so they can keep you up to speed. Now, we need, for the discussion forum, we need 3 volunteers that will work on developing an overview of the collection that they work in. So we need these people to volunteer themselves by emailing Michelle. Please do this before the end of today. This is because we don't have much time, so we need to get ready for the discussion forum. So if you are willing to do this, email Michelle right after this webinar, and These people will also be the ones that will do a presentation at the discussion forum next week about that document, that overview of their collection. So yes, it has to take 5 to 10 minutes, your presentation. So it's not long. Thank you. Thank you in advance for volunteering. So I'll take it back to Michelle.
So if we don't get volunteers, then we'll just select people, or we'll just ask people. So that's, what we're asking for there is, it was number 3, set of documents number 3 that Fulu talked about, the collection overview. And so what we would be asking is that you follow the points that are in the manual or in that slide, and you put together information that would serve as your collection overview, and you present it to give an example to everybody who still needs to develop that kind of document. And what we'd like to do is to try and get like different sort of types of institutions and collections. So we'll see volunteers, we'll be very happy. We may not take all of you if we get a flood. We'll pick 3 to represent different types of institutions and collections. But if we don't get 3, then we'll just have to approach people and ask them. So so we'll do that at the discussion forum next week. Fulu, I think it might be quite interesting. So Nikisha is asking us to put my email address there. We must do that. Fulu, it might be quite interesting to do the poll now. Now everybody has seen even more about this collection documentation that we're talking about, and they may have swung in the opposite direction to where they were. So let's run that poll now and see what people think. So sorry about it before, but let's do it anyway. I think it could be interesting. All right, can you launch it, Fulu? Is it you or Chanel?
Chanel will launch it.
Okay, thanks, Chanel. All right, so we're going to take like 3 minutes to do this poll. So like I said before, don't overthink it. Just go with your gut. Right, off you go. There it is.
Yeah, it seems like most people have voted in the end of the poll.
Okay, so let's have a look here. So it's a lot of bureaucratic stuff. Okay, so most people don't think so. It takes up too much time that I don't have. Sure, I'm surprised. I know people are very busy. Not true. So nearly 60% said it's not true. I don't think it's necessary. We know what we're doing. So 92% said that's not true. We've managed without a lot of paperwork until now. Nearly 70% said that's not true. I think that it'll help me in my work. Nearly 90% of people said that. I'd like to meet global standards in collection management, 94%, so that's great. It should be done by management, not me. So most people accept responsibility. I would deal with it if I knew how to, but it seems overwhelming. Okay, so yeah, we've got 40% saying yes, this is overwhelming, and I'm sure it is. And 45% say no, it's fine, we know we can deal with it. And then this one, I'm scared that management or the auditors will use it to get us. If it's not written down, no one can question us. So 71% said no, that's fine. They don't agree with that. It'll cost too much money and we don't have budget. So 60% people said that's not a big issue. So that's interesting. So it would have been interesting to do this before we did the webinar. Yeah, so I think that's very encouraging that so many people understand the importance of the documentation and feel that it is feasible and it should be done. So that's great. Thank you for that input. Okay, Fulu, do we want to look at the questions now? Thank you very much for attending the webinar. I hope you found it useful and not too daunting. And we'd encourage you to join us next week for the discussion forum you know, things might come up during the week for you about collection documentation. That will also be an opportunity to ask questions. So thanks everybody, and thanks to Fulu and Chanel as well. Thanks. Okay.